Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Theater. I'm your host, Josh Treese. I'm a practicing therapist in Music City, USA, and every week, a guest therapist, counselor, or social worker joins me in the theater to talk about a movie that we've seen and what relationships or mental health issues it highlights. Thanks so much for downloading today's show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And while you're doing that, you can help other people find it by giving the show a 5-star rating and writing a review for it in the podcast app. Oh yeah, and make sure you tell your friends. You can also stay connected with what's happening in the theater by following us on social media. Links to our accounts are in the show notes. This week's guest is Natalie LeQuang. Natalie's the owner of Safe Haven Trauma Services, a trauma-focused group practice here in Nashville. She specializes in complex trauma and dissociation, including dissociative disorders. She also hosts the podcast, The Resilient Mind, which focuses on complex trauma and dissociation. Let's get the show started, shall we? Dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater. Natalie, hi.
Hi.
It is so nice to meet you. I'm so excited to have you here today. I would love to start out our conversation by just asking you about before you got into therapy counseling as a either client, student, practitioner, did you have any concept of what therapy counseling was, and where do you think, if you had one, that you got that concept from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I studied psychology in undergrad, and so I took a class that talked about different theories, and the one that really stuck out to me was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I thought that therapy was really structured. Some of the information about CBT really made sense to me. And then I think the first times that I went into therapy, I also had an experience that didn't match my expectations. And I had like a couple of therapists that really did a lot of sort of like the head nod, like sort of like agreeing with everything you said, that sort of thing. And I remember having the thought, this cannot be what I'm going to be doing. Something like this, it was very interesting. And so I see myself as a pretty determined person. And so I was like, I've been to a couple of therapists where this is kind of what is happening in therapy, but it doesn't seem to really be helping me. And so I finally found a therapist that had more of an attachment focus and an EMDR and trauma focus. And that ended up being life-changing for me, but it was much more relational. There was a lot more back and forth. It wasn't a lot of just sitting and nodding at me.
I had a friend in college who I went to a Bible college, and I think that in the church world, people are notorious for this, but I think that therapists are notorious for it too. In our attempt at active listening, you said the head nod. I think you get a noise with that head nod. You get a something like that.
Yes.
And my friend in college, when because you'd be in like a chapel or a presentation or something, and somebody on stage would say something, and this would make its way through the crowd like the wave or something like that. And my friend would always say, they must be serving cookies. As if people, so I always, whenever I hear somebody make that noise, I always just think like, there's some good cookies. So it sounds like, I'm kind of wondering, you said you studied psychology in your undergrad. How did you get there? Like, some interest had to have been sparked.
It goes actually all the way back to high school. When I took AP Psych, I really liked my professor, and I've always liked learning in general, but I was just fascinated with psychology.
Do you think that maybe your connection that you felt with your teacher in high school kind of helped nudge that along.
I do. I definitely do. And it's funny because she wasn't a therapist or anything. She wasn't really talking about therapy, but she was just like all the psychological concepts were so interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I originally wanted to be a psychiatrist and quickly learned that's not what I wanted to be. I, for a very long time, thought I was going to be a psychologist. And I ended up actually being a counselor.
Yeah. So quick maybe explanation of the differences between those three. Psychiatry, we're introducing the medical in there. So you get a medical degree or a PsyD, either MD or PsyD, because you're getting into the prescriptive medications along with the understanding of how the brain works and things. Psychology tends to be more academic, research getting thrown in there, studies, that kind of deal. And then therapy, counseling tends to be your kind of, you're sitting with the people in the rooms doing the therapy, relying on the psychologist's research to back up what you're doing, and occasionally referring out to psychiatry if that would benefit the patient.
Yes, definitely. And I think that I don't know for you what your thoughts are on this, but for me, what felt a little bit different about counseling and therapy is there wasn't at least in my graduate program, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on diagnosis. And so it also felt like a little bit more of a non-pathologizing approach. Not that we don't learn how to diagnose people and all of that, but
are you an MFT?
That stuck with me. I am an LPC-MHSP.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think that like in my particular program, so I'm an MFT.
Okay.
We were told MFTs tend to shy more away from diagnoses than LPCs do. Not saying that LPCs are diagnosis happy, that they're just like, with like a pen and paper ready to like write down a diagnosis for anybody, but just that, because marriage and family therapy comes from a more systemic relational approach, then naturally we're going to tend to kind of view things through that lens, more attachment based, like you said, than an LPC. But I mean, you're right. Naturally, a psychiatrist is going to diagnose. It's kind of like what they do.
Mm-hmm. Right. And to be honest, I probably would, MFT program probably would have been the best fit for me because of sort of the like systems attachment approach that I take in therapy.
Yeah.
So,
which really, in trying to talk to people about what the big difference between those is, effectively at the end of the day, LPCs and MFTs do the same thing, can do the same things. It's really just kind of how they understand how people and change work. That's really the big difference. Like an LPC is going to kind of, and please correct me, typically treat somebody a little bit more on an individual basis. Whereas like an MFT is going to say something like, let's talk about your whole family 3 generations back and try to look at patterns in relationships and how you, and look at things, systemically, like you're a part of a system and we can understand you better by looking at the context of that system rather than just you as a lone wolf.
Yes. I think my approach is probably more similar to what an MFT would take, but I think in school that's more of how it's presented.
Yeah. And some, there's some schools, like I remember the other grad school I looked at, they didn't have an MFT program. They had an LPC program. So if I would have ended up there, I'd have ended up in LPC, but I think I would have been more naturally attracted to the systemic approach, similar to where you came out. So sometimes it's not even a matter of choosing which you want to do. It's just you go into school somewhere and what do they got? We'll see. So it's interesting to hear you got into the undergrad psychology program because you had a great connection. There was an attachment that led you into the program. So what do you think your like concept or understanding was as a high school student who took Psych AP? Because I took Psych AP. I didn't pass the AP exam, but I took Psych AP, and I'm trying to think back to what I might have understood about it back then. And to me, I think that particular class, and it could have been the way that my teacher taught it, felt more like a history class than it did like what we do in grad school and what we do in practice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's some of what my class felt like as well. And, you mentioned that connection, and that definitely could be it. I think that's maybe why I thought I wanted to be a psychiatrist, because I was like, oh, some of this information plus medication, okay, maybe that makes sense in terms of something I would do. And then I think once I was in undergrad, I realized I wouldn't be doing a whole lot of therapy, and I started to learn what therapy was. And I think I wanted to be a psychologist because my favorite professors were all psychologists, and they were like, I don't really know what a counselor does. And so I was like, oh, I must want to be a psychologist. And they like I had this is where my interest in attachment came from. I had a professor that taught attachment across the lifespan, so I had a whole semester on attachment in undergrad, and then I had a whole semester of trauma across the lifespan with a different professor that I really looked up to.
Wow, that's cool. So, I mean, we kind of got into this a little bit already, but let me formally throw it out there. Maybe you can kind of connect some dots. Why therapy? Why do you do what you do?
Yes. So when I took that trauma across the lifespan class, um, my professor specialized in researching and treating dissociative disorders, including dissociative identity disorder. And so I very quickly became interested in that. And she suggested I do an internship at Shepherd Pratt's trauma disorders unit, which I was fortunate enough to be able to do while in undergrad. And so a lot of people on that unit had dissociative identity disorder, complex trauma. And so that is how I was first exposed to my interest in working with trauma. And so I was very fascinated with just people's ability to survive some of the most horrific experiences, and also how the mind adapted to cope with unbearable experiences. And so I think that's how it started. But once I was in grad school, um, I quickly realized that I had my own trauma history. And so I don't think previously in my life I was at a place where I felt safe enough to really come in contact with that reality. And so then I experienced my own healing in therapy during grad school. And so then I also believed that it was possible to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So I, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about um, just the way you phrased, you realized, I forgot the exact word, but you realized that you had your own trauma in your history. I don't want to ask you to talk about anything personal, but maybe that's an interesting thing to say. You were in grad school, which mid 20s to, I mean, I was in grad school in my mid 30s, but like, you know, so you would think that a person would just know that they had trauma or know that they didn't have trauma, but you kind of came awake to this, to something from the past. Could you talk a little bit about how a person could not be aware and then achieve awareness?
Sure. Well, I think that there is intergenerational trauma in my family. So, my dad came to the United States from Vietnam during the Vietnam War at a pretty young age, definitely under 10 years old. And so, I think some of that and how my family learned to cope had like a trickle down effect. So I think I experienced some of the effects of having a parent who was an immigrant and experienced some tough things in coming to this country. And I think that generally, I don't know, I think like we think of trauma oftentimes, unless we have that, you know, psychology education in what trauma is. I think a lot of people think about it as like combat trauma from war or like a car accident or being in some sort of natural disaster. And so I think
Or like
as
a
I
sexual
learned
assault,
about
I think
it,
is a pretty
yes.
like
Mm-hmm.
one that's thought of typically when it comes to trauma.
Yes, yes, definitely. And I think like, you know, I specialize in dissociation and I definitely I think myself had used dissociation as a coping mechanism at one point in my life, quite a bit. And so I think that I had to have like a certain level of safety and support, which I really had in my grad program, of feeling accepted for who I was. Like I've always been a sensitive person, which I think something that wasn't necessarily valued in my family of origin. And so I think like being in a really supportive environment, it's like, oh, like there are some things just like a lot of like invalidation growing up and that sort of thing, among a variety of other things that I probably won't go into, but
Yeah.
um, yeah. And so I think being in a place where I had the support I needed and then finding a counselor that I felt safe enough with and who was willing to build that relationship with me, I think that's where things started to really be revealed to me.
Yeah. So my guest last week, Garrett DeBoard, he talked about how, you know, therapy is a process and people will there's my southern accent. People will deal with things when they are ready and when they are able to deal with them. So maybe a therapist might spot something in a client and maybe push for it, but if that person's not ready or able to deal with that yet, you know, that might be the therapist wanting to deal with it for them and not for the client. So it sounds like through your journey, maybe through a couple of different therapists, but also just kind of growing up as a person and finding like, I mean, I don't know what the right word for it is, but let's just say like purpose, but like you felt like you belonged in grad school. You felt like, oh, I'm doing something that feels fulfilling and worthwhile. And maybe you know, felt like you had matured a bit. Your feet were steady enough to where you could tackle something abstract and something a little more, you know, difficult.
Yes, yes. I think that the two things you said that stand out to me is like having a sense of purpose allowed me
Mhm.
to go there, and then also a sense of belonging and support. And then having a therapist that I felt like was safe enough to really be my like true authentic self with
Yeah.
her, and that I would be accepted in that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's some attachment level stuff right there. Um, that feels very like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like at the base of the pyramid or triangle is like your physical stuff. So like, are you warm? You know, do you have food and water? And at the very top is self-actualization. And so until, you know, the base is built, you can't really go up into the abstract kind of personal uh area because it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Definitely.
Um, so let's talk about a movie. What movie did you bring for us to talk about?
Frankie and Alice. Um,
2010, and we said right before we started recording that it I don't know, maybe you said that you had. I had never heard of this movie until you when we were emailing back and forth about what to cover until you brought it up. Came out 10 years ago, 2010. And it just slid right by me. But it was incredible.
I really liked it too. And I had heard of it, but I had not watched it. And I have pretty intentionally avoided watching movies about dissociative identity disorder because I think that those movies often sensationalize DID and a lot of times also portray people with DID as like monsters or murderers,
Yeah,
which
vilifies them. Yeah.
yes, is not what I've found to be the case in working with DID. I think that a lot of clients that I know with DID are some of the most kind, compassionate,
Hmm.
caring people.
So which that's so I had a guest on a little while ago, Amy Mary Askin, who specializes in OCD, and she said something very similar about like engaging with, like she said, I hate Monk because Monk doesn't portray OCD at all the way that it really is, you know. So I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. So let's kind of like build a base before we really run into the movie. You told us what DID stood for, dissociative identity disorder, but can you tell the listeners a little bit about what it is?
Sure, definitely. So, it is typically a trauma-based disorder. So there's usually early childhood trauma or adverse experiences. So it can also include things like early surgeries and that sort of thing that are just very overwhelming for a person. And what it looks like in adulthood is different ways of being you. So there would be at least two different parts of a person that are presenting themselves. There is often amnesia or lost time. Other common symptoms are depersonalization, derealization, uh, depersonal depersonalization is more about like not feeling like you are real, or not feeling like this body is your body. Derealization is more about not feeling like your surroundings are real or feeling very disconnected from your surroundings. There's also identity confusion, where people feel confused about who they really are. There's identity alteration, which is kind of like switches in ways of being. So like different ways of being in the world. And
So
all those,
keep going.
oh, I was just going to say, all those different ways of being are ways that a person learned to adapt. And so all parts of a person have a particular purpose.
So that sounds like it's really an attempt by a person, whether consciously or unconsciously, to cope with and deal with the world around them.
Yes, definitely. And a lot of times, we talked about MFTs and systems approaches. And one of my mentors is a marriage and family therapist. And how she got into this work was realizing that it's almost like having a family inside of you. And all parts inside have adapted to maybe various things on the outside, where a lot of times relationships that are confusing or abusive.
Which feels very internal family systems. Like
Yes.
it feels very recognizing, the whole punch behind internal family systems, as depicted wonderfully in the movie Inside Out, is, I remember when I got introduced to it in grad school, I pushed against it a little because I thought that seems really disintegrating. It seems like you're purposefully splitting people, when I thought a whole point behind this was to try to integrate. And then my prof explained it to me like, haven't you ever said, well, part of me thinks this, but another part of me thinks that? And I was like, yeah. She goes, yeah, that's IFS right there. Like it's recognizing that you have different aspects of your personality that kick in at different times as ways of helping you conceptualize and deal with the world. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, well, that makes sense then. And so it sounds like this is like a cousin of that, wherein, the dissociated parts are maybe aspects of the personality that a person trusts or asks to handle various parts of the world or situations.
Yes, yes. And I think there are some people that work with DID that do use IFS. So I think it is something that can be applied to working with DID.
Yeah, I think, you said something early on that that trauma is typical in the life of people who have DID. And you mentioned surgeries, which I don't think I would have expected. But as you said that, I thought to myself, most traumas, if not all traumas, have something in common, that the person who has experienced the trauma felt out of control.
Yes.
And I could see if a child is having to have some kind of major surgery that they feel like they don't have a voice in, or really and truthfully an understanding of, I
Mm-hmm.
could definitely see that feeling like something really huge that's being forced on them, that's happening to them, that they don't feel in control of, and thus it being, I think my original thought, you said surgeries, was like, well, that's probably to save their life. It's a good thing. But if I put myself in the place of, 7-year-old me, if I was going to have a giant surgery, my guess is it's not something that my parents or a doctor are going to spend so long trying to explain to me why and all the aspects. They're going to say, we got to go do this, buddy. Like, and I
Mm-hmm.
could definitely feel that being traumatic.
Yeah. And if you think about it, it's like you maybe are left in a pretty like cold, sterile place
Mhm.
with strangers. Your parents that are supposed to love and protect you are leaving you with these people that are maybe causing things that are to save your life, but you're perceiving it as causing you
Scary.
extreme pain
Yeah.
or really scary. And so,
You're
you
naked, or
know,
you're close to naked.
yes, yeah, yeah. So I think just part of it is just a lack of understanding for the child. And even I think like a 2-year-old, how do you even explain something like that to a 2-year-old, even if you did take the time? I
Yeah.
think developmentally, it's just hard for them to understand.
Yeah. So that's kind of our basic understanding of DID. And I think, I mentioned to you before we started recording, I was really excited to talk to you about this because I think that it is something, we use the word sensationalized. It's something that in movies, especially in TV shows, sensationalized, vilified. I know that in the past, they called, multiple personality disorder, but they also would use the term schizophrenic to describe that as well. And that's not what schizophrenia is. Although at one point in this movie, the doctor does have some books on schizophrenia on his desk.
Mm-hmm.
But this was, I think, taking place in the 70s, 60s or 70s. So I would imagine, the understanding of this, not quite where it is today. Um, but I think to talk about it because, it is something that, like in movies, supervillains have. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that whenever we see something depicted in fiction, it's really easy to settle on one understanding of it. But when you sit with real people, there's a different understanding that develops. So I'm glad that we're taking the chance to talk about the real thing rather than just a
Mm-hmm.
plot point. So the movie in and of itself, Frankie and Alice, Halle Berry is the star. Stellan Skarsgård is also in it. She is a lady who grew up in Georgia in the 50s. I don't know where the movie's taking place in present day. I think I assumed LA because of the view out of his office, but I don't know that.
I'm not sure either. I saw
Yeah.
something at the very beginning about Savannah, Georgia, but I think it was saying that's where
Oh,
she grew up. I
yeah.
think.
Yeah, that view out his window was not Savannah. I've been to Savannah. That was not it. But she at the beginning of the movie is a stripper, and she meets a guy, goes home with him. When she is at his house, there's a like a baby toy rattle stuffed animal thing that she steps on, and it like triggers her, and it looks like
Yes.
she gets disoriented. I think it seems like in those cases, so it's like a typical in a movie, a person getting disoriented. The camera gets all kind of wonky to kind of
Mm-hmm.
show that they're off balance. There's a lot of like noise amplification. It seems like there's little light trails on everything they see. I think if I was going to try to describe that to somebody, I would say it's like their senses go into overdrive.
Mm-hmm. And I think that can happen with someone with DID. So like stuffed animals, toys can trigger a child part. Probably like more likely in a safe environment. But I think what felt maybe somewhat real is that they didn't really explain this, but I think they were showing crying, but then she like looks and there's no baby in there in the
Mhm.
crib. And people that I work with sometimes do experience crying in their head, that is coming from a part of self, but it's sort of disorienting, just like it is to her, where she's like hearing that, feeling confused, disoriented. And so I felt like it wasn't really clear what was happening, but some of that is relatively realistic.
I kind of thought based on a part that comes up later in the movie, and I forgot to say this to you before we start recording, but we don't worry about spoilers here, especially if it's like
Okay.
the name of the movie is in the title of the show. So if somebody clicks on it to listen, there by the grace of God go they. But like because of something that comes out later that she actually has given birth to a child, I kind of maybe at the end of the movie thought, I wonder if that was like a PTSD kind of thing where she has this trigger that happens and the line between the past and the present gets a little blurred in her head.
Yes, I think that's definitely also a possibility. I think something that was a little bit confusing about the movie in terms of what DID really looks like versus how it's portrayed in the movie is they didn't really explain or go into the part genius and like where that part was coming from or
Mhm.
the function of that part. And something like a car accident as a teenager and giving birth to a baby that is taken from you, that would not be something that would typically cause DID. Like I've never encountered anything
Mhm.
that's happening that late in life. And I feel like the movie makes it seem like that's why she has DID.
Yeah. So that's the first time that we see. Oh, well, let me ask you this before I want to use proper language. What's the right way to refer to a dissociated part of someone?
That definitely varies based on who you're talking to. So I think there are a lot of things that would be okay to use. Some people, a lot of times with my clients, I just use parts language. So the part of you that this or may speak with that part, that kind of thing. Some people use the term self states. Sometimes people use dissociative parts of the personality. Sometimes people use the word alters.
Mhm.
I think really it's best when working with clients to use whatever language that feels most comfortable to them. But
Okay.
I guess clinically, any of those
Yeah.
can be used.
I was going to say, I've seen a few videos on YouTube where the person in the video is professing to have dissociative identity disorder. I don't know how legit it is, but the videos are typically titled like "Meet My Alters" and something like that. So I don't know. It's tough to really know. Like I said, the legit part of something like that. But in Frankie's case, this is the first time we meet one of her parts when she has gone home with this guy, and the part that we meet at first appears to be a very racist Southern woman, um, and she, uh, I think, feels threatened and attacked. And so she attacks back. She grabs a picture frame, smashes it on the guy's head, and takes off running out of his apartment into the street where because of her disoriented state, she, almost gets run over several times until she just lays down on the ground and I assume passes out.
Mm-hmm.
She's picked up, taken into I guess, a psychiatric hospital, or maybe just a psychiatric wing of a hospital. I'm not sure, where, the treatment kind of begins. But that was the first time that we meet one of these other parts.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think that well, I mean, I guess you said this. I was going to say there's any rhyme or reason why any one part comes out at any time. Why do you think that part came out then? I mean, I suppose it's speculation because this is a character, but
Yes. Yes. I think that's a part that was a little bit confusing too about this presentation. And it's like, I personally have not worked with somebody that has a part that's like a different race, but with people who have experienced extreme racism and that sort of thing, it is possible for that to be a part in their system, basically like a racist white person. And so I don't know how I perceive that part is some sort of protector. And so she definitely did feel threatened, confused, maybe with that switch, wasn't really sure who she was talking to or where she was. There was like the baby stuff that could have also been triggering. And so I think her, like to think about fight, flight, freeze, it was like run, but I think he was like grabbing onto her or something, which is where like a fight response might have come out.
It seemed like initially she got really, when she stepped on the toy, she was very confused all of a sudden. So I wonder if that was her protective part. It wasn't like an immediate, that part came out as soon as she stepped on the toy, but it was like she felt disoriented enough to where she needed in her mind a protector. And then that's when that came out.
Right. And then I think somebody would have to be severely disoriented to run into traffic the way that she did. I don't know how likely that would be to happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that seemed also a little bit extreme. But yeah, I think that like to think about the function of parts, that part seems like a protector, even from, the doctor in later scenes.
Yeah. So when she wakes up, she's in the hospital. The Stellan Skarsgård, the guy that he's playing, who IMDb just lists as Oz, he is not the one that would have typically taken her, but it sounds like he's just the one that's there. And so he just gets asked to do an intake, which I think for any of us that have ever worked in an agency, that doesn't feel very impossible. I think that all of us have, been asked at one point, hey, we need you to do an intake. Oh, okay, cool. But he does this intake with her, and it seems like I don't want to say he doesn't believe her, but I don't know if he thinks there's anything necessarily wrong with her until towards the end of their time together. That same part that came out comes back. And during the first part of his intake interview with her, when she was just presenting as her original self, I mean, I don't quite know how to call that. She was smoking.
Right.
And then I think like what you're saying, it seems like she felt very vulnerable. She felt like maybe the doctor was asking questions that she didn't want to talk about. So her protector part comes out. And then she walks out to leave. He looks at the desk, sees her cigarettes, runs to give them to her. She speaks back to him with a different accent, with a Southern accent, and says, I don't smoke. I've never smoked. That's not something I'm into. And that's kind of, you see like the light bulb go off with him, like, oh, okay, this is weird.
Yes.
Yeah. And then he starts to dive in.
I think something that rings true is that people can go into the hospital and actually present. This isn't everybody with DID, but some people with DID can go in and they don't feel safe in a hospital, and so they actually present as fine, like high functioning, not even very suicidal. Even if they had just told a therapist that they know like that they have a relationship with, that they're feeling suicidal, the therapist might send them to the hospital, and they go and they might feel not safe and actually feel a little bit confused about why they're there and not sure why they've been sent there. And so I think on the other side of things, somebody doing an assessment with somebody in this situation might feel confused, kind of like how the doctor was a little bit confused until, what you're talking about with the cigarettes and the accent.
That kind of reminds me a little bit of like an avoidant attachment style. Like when that's developed in childhood, it kind of surfaces because a kid is not sure whether their primary attachment figures, most of the time parents, will give them comfort when they're in distress. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And so because they can never be sure when they're in distress, they try their best to hide it. They withdraw inside. And, I think about that like video that I'm sure that like everybody learning attachment theory watched, of the experiment where the mom and the kid go into a room and a stranger comes in and then the mom leaves, and they're showing a kid with secure attachment, a kid with anxious attachment, a kid with avoidant attachment. And the kid with avoidant attachment, when the mom leaves, like stone face. Then when the mom comes back, stone face. Whereas like the secure attachment, he's running up to the mom, his hands are up, he's crying, and when the mom picks him up, gives him comfort, he begins to regulate. But with the avoidant attachment kid, tries to play like he doesn't notice mom. When she picks him up, even kind of looks away while he's on her lap. But they say later when they began to monitor heart rate, his little heart rate was going so strong the whole time. And what that kind of lends a person to believe is that, he was in distress, his body was experiencing distress, but he didn't feel comfortable showing that distress. And so this kind of scenario kind of reminds me a little bit about that. Like, you may cognitively believe, okay, I need help. But then when you get in there, it's so freaky and it's so scary that all of a sudden you go into this like self-preservation mode, and her protective part comes out as a way of like, I gotta do something. I gotta make sure that we survive.
Yes. And I would say most people with DID have disorganized attachment. And I think how it presents itself is, the part, Alice does have more of that avoidant tendency and like a pushing away. And Genius probably has more of an anxious attachment style and wants to like cling on to the doctor or like get help and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think in working with DID clients, how it presents itself is if there is a child part that is really wanting to be taken care of by the therapist, by a partner, by anybody in their life, very close behind that, there is a protector part that's keeping an eye on things. When things start to feel too close, that's when some of that protection sort of behavior comes out.
That feels like you got one foot on the gas, one foot on the brake, and you're closely kind of monitoring, almost like a borderline kind of thing where you got one hand up to block and you got another hand signaling to come closer.
Yes.
So you mentioned I don't know if it's technically the second or the third part. I guess if you consider the original personality, part 0, then this would be the second one. But another part shows up in Oz's treatment of Frankie. I believe he uses hypnosis to invoke the child part of her that comes out. But when he does, he gets introduced to this child part who is described as the genius because her IQ when measured is higher than the other twos. But, physically, which like props to Halle Berry, because when she portrays Frankie, the original person, Alice, the first part that we met that was like the racist white lady, and then the child part who was never given a name, but just called Genius. she changes her body. Like she has different mannerisms. She holds her jaw different when she's the child. But I think like what you were saying, the child seems very anxious, uh, kind of assuming in the chair like a cannonball position, like she's kind of hugging her knees a little bit and seems very scared. This was something that I thought was funny, and I'm curious what you would say about this. I don't know how much of this is kind of that sensationalism that we talked about, but in this movie, it's depicted that the other the other parts have different blood pressures. The child requires glasses, whereas the other two don't. And they comment on the child's IQ being in the 160s or 150s, Alice's IQ being in the 150s or 130s or something, and then Frankie's being barely above average. So it's almost as if we've got three different people. I mean, blood pressures that are different. Is that something that Hollywood has kind of put out there, or is there any truth to that?
So some of that does happen. Like I've had clients where they say they need glasses sometimes, other times they don't. And from what I've read in research, that's not impossible. However, I don't think that everybody presents with that drastic of differences in parts. And so trying to think of an example. Yeah, I think like the best example is maybe like what, as far as what I've seen is like writing with different hands, like being ambidextrous, but usually whatever part I'm interacting with, that is why the like handwriting changes from left to right. And I have seen differences in handwriting.
Yeah, that was.
I don't know as much about the medical stuff because I
Sure.
haven't measured those things.
That was even something that I think that helped Frankie realize what was going on was I think she looked in her checkbook and saw that one of the signatures was really different than others. I think that that's something, you know, you've said a few times when we're talking about a specific quality. This doesn't show up in every presentation. So I think that if we're talking about any kind of disorder that may be diagnosable, that may appear in the DSM-5, if we were going to diagnose somebody in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is what we use for that, we're given criteria for the diagnoses. Typically, it's going to be somewhere between, I think, 5 to 9 items. And then there's usually a subsection in case it's showing up in a child that gives extra criteria. But it's always said, you know, to have this diagnosis, you have to meet X amount out of these 9 or however many things. And that's because people are complex and unique, and not everybody presents in the exact same way, even if, you know, we're talking about a fairly well-known disorder. And so even, you know, with DID, of course, it's not going to show up exactly the same in everybody. But if we took those however many criteria the DSM has for it, they're going to, if they have the diagnosis, they're going to hit the number that needs to be hit out of that 9 or 10 or however many.
Yes. Yeah. I think the criteria for DID, it's interesting because there are not very many. I think it's just a few. And
that feels ironic.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I think like diagnostic tools to make a diagnosis are much more in depth. So I'm not really sure what the thought was in creating the DID diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5.
Well, who knows? I mean, I thought that I heard in grad school, they were like, yeah, the DSM-5 is going to be like out of style in like the next year. We're all going to, you know, make sure you buy a copy for this class, but you're not going to need it next year. Something like that. And the, you know, the update or the switch to the, what is it, ISM or whatever it is, hasn't happened yet totally. So who knows when that'll happen, but when it does, maybe they'll change, you know, the criteria or whatever they require. So as you were talking, when we first started talking about the first part of Frankie's that comes out, later on, that part's given the name Alice. As we progress through the movie, we meet Frankie's family, her mother, and I assume her sister. That was
That
also
was
at
my assumption too.
the dinner table. And we get more of her story. She grew up in the 50s. Her mom was housekeeper, maid, in a rich white family's house. And Frankie was there. At one point, we see her as a little kid running around, but also we see her as a teenager. Some point in the story, she goes to meet her mom and sister for dinner and finds out that somebody from her past is getting married. That kind of triggers something in her head. She shows up at the wedding and is not welcome there. The bride, who I think at this point we realize is a childhood friend, is like vehemently like, "What are you doing here?" Slaps her. Everybody at the wedding tries to force her to leave. She somehow cuts a guy with a butter knife, which I thought was interesting. But we find out later that was the daughter in the family that her mom worked for. At some point, she walks in and sees her brother and Frankie in the throes of passion and, says, "What are you doing?" As if it weren't obvious. And then I don't really know what happens in the story after, like in between, but the brother at some point is whisking Frankie away. Like they are running away together. They're in a car. They kind of keep flashing back to this every now and then. But he's looking at her and she says, "You came for me." And it's this beautiful romantic thing. And then that thing that happens in a lot of movies where the camera is from her perspective looking at him in the driver's seat, and all of a sudden a car just T-bones them out of nowhere and kills him. I don't know how she made it out like unscathed, but because it was a convertible, kills him. And then later on in the story, we find out that she was actually pregnant. And my guess is, when we were talking about earlier, why did that part come out then? And why was it a white racist lady part? I think she felt so ostracized and made other in that house with that family. I think what you said, the protector part, I think that it was a white racist lady because she wanted to belong so much, and that's maybe how she perceived them.
Yes. And so this could be what some people refer to as like an introject. And the part that's a little bit confusing is that it comes from the car accident. That part is a little bit confusing in terms of what DID really looks like. But essentially, if a person is around a person or people, so maybe even society, that is abusive in some way, they can create an internal representation of that.
Of
So
the
it's
abuse?
almost like, yes. And so it's like almost she has an internal representation of a white person that is, maybe created for the purpose of self-hatred and being told that you are not okay, which was actually, she was probably not safe around those white people in that setting.
So almost like a personification of toxic shame?
Yes. I would say similar to that. Yes.
Oh. So at some point, there's all kinds of like hospital politicky kind of stuff that happens in the story. There always is when it comes to a movie like this. There's a good doctor, there's a bad doctor, get her out of the hospital, whatever. Not important to the story. But at some point, Oz hypnotizes her again after he kind of realizes, and he uses hypnosis. Is that something that you use in your treatment?
So I am trained in hypnosis. I don't ever use it the way that he does. So like when I use hypnosis, It's never to go back and discover like a repressed memory. People with DID tend to be highly hypnotizable. And so it can be really helpful with teaching coping skills and that sort of thing. So for example, if you have them imagine a dial that goes from 0 to 100, and you can do this with just about any symptom. So let's say it's dissociation and they're saying, I feel like I'm at, a 99 out of 100. My dissociation's so strong. Something that you can do that would not work with me personally is have them dial down. So go, okay, and usually it helps to go higher first. So can you get to 100 in terms of dissociation? They usually can do that. And then starting to, okay, so if you can go up, that means you can also go down, and starting to dial down the symptom.
Are you having them imagine like putting their hand on the dial and like turning it?
Maybe. It kind of depends on how they imagine it. So they might imagine turning it down. Hypnosis is very creative. So it kind of is using whatever works for the client, and their own creativity and imagery is often involved, but just like turning it down bit by bit. And as you turn it down, notice feeling more present and that sort of thing. And that can be used. I've used that with people with sadness, with anger, like all sorts of things.
Wow. So you as the practitioner are maybe using language that is less descriptive to allow them room to create the imagery themselves.
Yes. And I usually ask them to tell me like what it is that they're adding to the imagery, and that can be really helpful. Okay. And so if you think about safe place imagery, containment imagery, those sorts of things, those are all things that are enhanced through hypnosis. And this isn't true, again, of all people with DID, but a lot of clients that I work with can really vividly imagine things in a way that really helps them to feel. So like if they're imagining a safe place, can really help them to feel there in that place.
Yeah. I think that, so how much, I work primarily with people with addictions, and specifically sex addictions, and fantasy is such a strong part of that. And it's really a tool that they use as a coping strategy. So like, life feels unbearable. Let me create the world into something that I can better understand, manage, control, enjoy, whatever. But it's when you slip into the fantasy, it's because real life feels so distressful. This is a way of helping me to deal with it. And it's really when there begin to be destructive consequences of using fantasy as a coping strategy that, addiction comes in, and we've got to look at how do we find other tools. It feels like, the things that you're saying about when people have DID, to have this ability to very vividly construct these things, that feels very much like what I experience with my clients in addiction, because I feel out of control, because I feel in danger, because I don't feel safe. I want to give myself more influence, more ability to have agency. And so, boom, I've created Joshtopia. Is that kind of that creative part that you're talking about, kind of where that muscle gets flexed?
I think it's important for it to not be used as like an escape, like what you're talking about. Okay. And so some people, and I don't know if you have heard of this newer term. It's called maladaptive daydreaming. So sometimes there could be people who have DID and maladaptive daydreaming, and the complexity of the inner world is much, much more detailed and complex and that sort of thing. And sometimes in those cases, I think it's about helping people to live in the here and now. But I don't work with a lot of people that have both of those things. With DID, if we're using imagery, it's maybe like if they're having flashbacks or they're feeling really unsafe, let's go into the safe place as you need it, but not like going there to live, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You're using it as a resource. You're not using it as an escape.
Yes.
In the movie, Oz used a flashlight to induce I don't know what you'd call it, hypnosis, hypnotic state, whichever. Do you use any tool to help somebody?
I don't. I think I don't know how much of that too is like hypnosis being sensationalized as well.
That did feel specific to her, because I think he
Yes.
noticed at some point when she got triggered, there was a light that, so I didn't get the sense that he did that with everybody. I just got the sense that maybe he had noticed it in her and used it because of that.
Yes. And I think like that, the way it's portrayed in movies is that sometimes there is a need for a tool in order to take a person into trance. It's really interesting in working with DID because people with DID are already in trance. That's where some of that switching comes in. It's like you don't even always necessarily have to say, here, let's do something to take you into trance. It's like they're already there, which is how they can believe they are a child, or how they can believe they are like a white racist woman when in fact she was not, is because of trance.
Oh, that's interesting. Have you read anything that would indicate that a person with DID would have a more active like theta state part of their brain, like the dreaming part of their brain might be more active?
That's a good question. I actually don't know.
Yeah, I know that, like, I just did training in brain spotting in September.
Okay.
And they talked about it activating that part of the brain. I also, as like a self-care thing myself, have occasionally gone and done something called flotation therapy, which I just cannot recommend enough. It is just absolutely the best. Basically, like, you lay in this big open tank that's like 4x8. The water has 2,000 pounds of Epsom salt dissolved into it. The water's 98 degrees. The air in the room's 98 degrees. And you float for 90 minutes, and your body can't tell the difference between the water and the air. And like, I've never had a massage in my life because it kind of creeps me out. But like, when I got out of my first float, it felt like every muscle in my body was relaxed, even though I didn't know they were tense. And before I did it, the people that worked there said it is not unusual for people to fall asleep and for their brain to go into theta mode, and for you to have a bunch of new ideas and creativity to be sparked, because it's just an environment that's conducive to that. And so it seems like what you're saying with a lot of people with DID, they have this very creative part of their brain that is, maybe not working overtime intentionally, but certainly working overtime. And so I'm just so curious, like, if anybody's done any studies to see if that part of the brain's a little more active.
That's a really good question. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. I also have done these float tanks and think they're great as well, which is hilarious because massages also creep me out.
Yeah,
so,
right.
I've only had one massage and I was like, I will never do that again.
I haven't even had one. I don't want.
But I do really like the float tanks, and that's interesting that you say that, because when I was in the float tank, I was like, oh, I can see this inducing trance, just like because of the conditions of it as well.
Yeah, I got to it after seeing a YouTube video of somebody creating their own training to be an astronaut, and they wanted to practice weightlessness. And so they went to a float place. And so I just got on Google and I was like, float therapy, Nashville. And I found Float Nashville over in the Berry Hill area. Shout out to Float Nashville. You guys are great. But then my wife and I, we were dating at the time, but we went together, and there's 3 rooms there. Where do you go? Do you go there?
I can't remember the place that I've been to. The one I've been to is over sort of not quite in Bellevue, I guess kind of sort of in Belmead. I don't remember what it's called.
There's been a few other places that have come into town, like in the past couple years.
Mm-hmm.
Float Nashville is great though, because in as much as I've looked, because I've seen like Groupons come up for some places, it seems like the other places give you a 60-minute sesh and Float Nashville gives you a 90.
I think mine was 60, actually,
Yeah.
now that you say that. Yeah.
Check
Yeah.
out Float Nashville. They're great.
Okay, I will.
But when my wife and I went for the first time, they had 3 rooms, which were private. So even though we went together, we were like in different rooms. And I was like, which is funny because I'm extremely claustrophobic. I was like, I'm going to go full sensory deprivation and do the one with a top on it. And my wife did the open one. And then when they took us there and they showed us the tanks and stuff, like the open one was like 4x8, but the one that I went into was like not. And it did have a top on it and stuff. And I think she saw my face when I saw it. She's like, we might want to switch. I was like, no. It's fine. It's fine. But the first time that I did it, I don't feel like I did like kind of a trance. And they had said like the first time you do, it's going to be so weird. You just kind of have to give yourself permission to play. And they talked about doing like snow angels and like just fall into the weirdness. But the second time I went, I fell asleep like almost right away, to the point it was one of those like time warp sleeps where you blink and, you know, an hour and a half's gone by. And when they had said the thing about like, oh yeah, your brain may do like the theta thing where you get all these ideas, like I'm like notorious with my wife for saying, love, I have a new idea. Let me tell you this. And her being like, oh my gosh, all right, here we go. I mean, that's how the podcast started too. It's just me being like, all right, I had this idea and here it is. And so she was like, oh no, we might, if he gets like more ideas while he's in there. And I was like, don't worry, there's no paper. I can't write anything down while I'm in there. So we're good. I'll forget it all. But it's interesting to hear about the trance state thing. And I think it's interesting to hear about hypnosis used with DID, because I think we've talked about DID being sensationalized. I think hypnosis is another thing that is used. I mean, how many times in movies do we see somebody pull out the pocket watch or the circle with the spiral on it, and you know, or the cane? I'm thinking Jafar now, the cane with the snake on the end with the eyes that have the spiral, you know, and it just seems like something that is used to dominate another person and control them.
Yes. And I think a lot of people are afraid of hypnosis for that reason, especially people with pretty significant trauma histories, as they're worried about the therapist trying to control them. And so I try to really emphasize, like, you are in control of your own trance. And then I think some people don't want to do hypnosis, and that's fine too.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important for clients to understand that they get to be in charge of what's happening, and it's not the therapist using it to control them in some way.
Yeah.
Which I do think the movie did a good job of, for the most part. Like, it didn't seem like he was trying to control her. He was trying to facilitate her healing. That's not how I use it, but I think the therapist-client relationship was good overall. Like, he seemed to have relatively good boundaries and that sort of thing. And maybe except for like going to her house and those sorts of things. But I think that what it showed well is the sort of rupture and repair that happens in relationship, like in the therapeutic relationship. Like, he told her she had to be there and she didn't actually have to be there. And so I felt like she felt safe enough to bring up, like, you lied to me. And I feel like there was a repair that was done there as well, which I think is so important in trauma therapy, is that there are going to be ruptures, and that the important part is the repairs that can happen.
I just thought of an interesting correlation. So like Stellan Skarsgård, who played Oz, was also in Good Will Hunting. And in both of these movies, the client tries to get a rise out of the therapist by talking about a wife who's no longer there.
Yes.
And in Good Will Hunting, like famously, Robin Williams like grabs Matt Damon by the neck and says, I will end you. And in this one, when she begins to make observations and remarks, you know, she sees that he's got a tan line on his wedding ring finger, but with no ring. he just kind of seems, he just kind of doesn't make a big deal out of it. He's just like, huh, yeah, good observation. We just weren't compatible. And then he just kind of moves on. And I thought, that is, I think, such a better response than what Robin Williams had in Good Will Hunting. But I also wonder how much of that was like matching the patient, kind of like reading the room and seeing what kind of response was needed, kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like it's tough because there are enactments that happen within the therapeutic relationship. And so sometimes like as therapists, we can get pulled into that too. So like that's definitely happened to me. And I think the important part is to realize what's happening and to work for that repair and helping the client to notice like what is different in the relationship versus maybe relationships growing up and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the therapeutic relationship, I remember in grad school they said that the best tool the therapist has is a therapeutic relationship, which I think, to me at the time, I was, when I heard that and was reminded of it again later, I was in this place where I thought I was so scared because I didn't know enough. Like I hadn't read all the books. I didn't know every intervention. Like, because I remember at certain times, like, you're in grad school and you're studying all these modalities. And I remember being with clients and almost like I was like spinning a Rolodex in my head, like, oh my gosh, which modality is needed for this client? Like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And I remember later on being with my supervisor and then kind of just realizing, man, if the therapeutic relationship is the best tool we have, then it's not even necessarily that I need to know what to do in the moment. I just need to know how to be. Like, I just need to know how to be in the moment and be with the person. And I was reminded of what, Dr. Harvey said before I had my very first client ever. At the end of class, I was like, what should I do? And he goes, join, and don't pee in the chair. And I was like, oh, I can definitely do one of those things. But I was reminded of that too. Like, if I don't know what to do, just be with the person, let them know that they're not alone. And then after the session, you can always look stuff up. Like you can always, and have it ready for the next session. And, I think I mentioned earlier how they had that like head psychiatrist guy at the hospital that was very clearly like the bad doctor, who it seemed, was presented as taking more of a diagnostic approach, whereas like Oz was really treating Frankie like a person and trying to be personable, even going out and getting her ding dongs from the convenience store, which she ate by scooping out the frosting from the middle part. To each their own. But that therapeutic relationship, that joining, that's why I ask, questions like, why therapy? What was your concept of therapy before? What have your clients taught you? Because it's not that talking to, it's that talking with, it's that being with people. And, you mentioned going through a few therapists before you found one that you could really feel comfortable with. And I think something that I always try to tell people on the show is just, getting a therapist is a lot like dating. Like if you schedule an appointment with one and have your intake and something inside of you just feels off, please don't feel obligated to go back to that person. Like they may want to ask questions. What can you say something that maybe I did that, because obviously if it happens with one, it could happen with others, and you don't want to do that, but you are not bound to a therapist. And
Yes.
if something in your limbic system is going off, it just doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel right, please listen to that part of you. Please. And any therapist that I know, if you said, I just don't feel like I'm connecting, would probably offer to give you some names of people that they know to hopefully help you find somebody you will connect with.
Yes.
It's just such an important part.
I think that's a huge part. And I think that is a huge part, for anyone. And then I think with DID specifically, I actually think the movie, you said it's very typical of movies for there to be a bad doctor and a good doctor, but I don't know if you know the scene where all the doctors are sitting in a meeting and he comes in, he's like, you discharge my patient. And there were lots of comments sort of throughout about like, maybe she's like doing this for attention or like sort of implying that something else is going on other than DID. And I think that actually happens a lot. So like at hospitals with other therapists, so like I've like what he experienced with other professionals, I have had that experience. And it's very telling for me of what it must be like for my clients who have come in contact with therapists or psychiatrists, that like if they're treating me that way, how are they treating the client who's presenting with DID symptoms?
Yeah.
So.
And I couldn't help but think about in that part as well. So could be that the staff there wasn't believing DID. It's also not lost on me. You know, Halle Berry herself is an African American woman. She's playing an African American woman, and African American women are historically not believed, not offered the same healthcare attention that that people of other races and other genders are. And so I couldn't help but wonder how much of that, played a part, because this was taking place in the 70s, I think. So and if it's bad now,
Yes.
couldn't help but wonder if how much that, played into that as well.
Yes, definitely. I recently watched a presentation that Heather Hall did, and she was talking about how Black people are more often diagnosed with schizophrenia when maybe a dissociative disorder is actually what's going on. So I think you definitely have a point there.
There's that like misnomer again. Schizophrenia is, that term used for this when it's not really that.
Yes. Yes.
Well, the scene that happens a little bit later, whenever, which also at some point, Oz has gone into a convenience store to get tuna salad. And he notices that there's a security camera. And it's like he puts two and two together and for the first time thinks, oh, I should video her when I'm working with her. And I thought, when is this that a doctor wouldn't think about video? Like, what in the world? Like, were video cameras just so rare in the 70s when this was happening that never crossed his mind to do this? But he through hypnosis induces the genius part to come to the forefront. And it seems like in this instance, it's kind of alternating between the genius and Frankie and Alice, but she is reliving delivering her child. And this is kind of, it's like a lot mixed into this. And that's kind of where we are told that a car accident had happened. But she says, we had names picked out. If it was a boy, he was going to be named, oh, I don't remember now. Shoot.
Was it Emmett, maybe?
Yes, Emmett, yes. And if it's a girl, Alice. And we had been told a little while before that, he had asked the child part what the other part's name was, and she wrote down Alice. And so you realize that this protective part of her was going to be her daughter's name. And I don't remember if they revealed what gender the child was when it was born. And it's not even made clear. So the child is, the mom helps deliver it. And it's was the child stillborn? It's not really revealed whether the child was stillborn or whether the mom was trying to protect Frankie, but she immediately wraps the child up in a blanket and like runs out of the hotel room into the pouring rain to where, who knows? And Frankie runs after her, but she has just given birth. So I'm sure she's fairly weak and, kind of like collapses on her knees in the parking lot in the rain. But the daughter's name was the name of the protective part.
Yeah. I thought that was very interesting too. And it's almost like this is where it gets a little confusing because it makes sense in a way, because it almost felt like that part was protecting her from knowing what happened to her. And so I can see that being the function of the part and that being the reason maybe that the name was Alice. It's like the white racist thing. Like it almost feels like those would be two separate parts typically, but yeah, I throughout it, I do sort of get the sense that Alice is not wanting her to know what happened, like protecting her from the pain of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think prior to watching the movie, I don't really know what, other than what movies had told me, I could conceptualize what DID is or how it is. I think after watching it, I saw a strong association between trauma and coping and DID.
Yes.
And so I think in that case, I thought, the movie did a really good job of presenting that aspect. Even if it didn't get every little thing right, I felt like that was a good representation of that.
Yes. I think it's like one of the best that I've heard about. Again, I haven't really seen a lot of other movies, but that's one that I have been told is probably gets almost the closest.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, at the end, you kind of see Frankie taking some positive steps, leaning into help. And we get this little kind of text scroll that says that, well, I guess Oz is telling her, hey, let's start treatment. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be progressive. It's going to be a path. And she says, it's kind of a shot of her painting, I guess, like a new apartment too. She says something like, well, is Alice going to try to stop me? He's like, well, that's going to be a conversation the two of you need to have. And he tells her that, you're really not going to get rid of these parts. You're going to have to learn to live with them. And then the text crawl says, with the help of the genius child part, she becomes a high school teacher. She goes back to school. She marries a psychiatrist, and so you get the sense that like she integrated and learned how to live with them and became, functional and healthy. And that's not something that I even had the slightest idea could be possible before watching this. Like, not only that you wouldn't want to get rid of the parts, but that they could be helpful as well.
Yes, definitely. And I think a huge part of treatment for DID is internal communication and cooperation. So it's like, yeah, her learning to work with Alice and Genius would be like a huge part of treatment. And the acceptance piece that's mentioned, I think that's also a huge piece. So a lot of people with DID don't want to believe it's true that they have parts, that they do things that they don't remember. Like there's a lot of denial and avoidance that usually shows up in treatment at some point. And so acceptance is definitely a big part of that, like acceptance of what happened growing up, acceptance of having DID, acceptance of, probably not getting certain needs met, and learning to live within the same body.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember Alice had a line at one point, like just indicating that she despised what Frankie did to the body that they had to share.
Yeah.
Is there anything else in the movie that you want to touch on?
I think something that I really liked, and this shows up at the end too, is I think this doctor does a really good job of collaborating with her. And again, not trying to like control the treatment or tell her what to do. And he's even able to say, I don't know. And I think sometimes he shows well the experience of working with DID and not being sure what to do and being able to name that, like, yeah, like sometimes, sometimes we're figuring this out together and I certainly don't have all the answers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is sometimes a tough thing to do as a therapist, because sometimes we slip into the misunderstanding that answers equal comfort.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's where I got stuck in grad school until I remembered that therapeutic relationship thing. Like I thought, well, if I don't have the answer, I'm doing a bad job.
Yes. And it's funny because when I went into grad school, I was very much a perfectionist and probably still am, but I quickly realized with working with complex trauma, I was like, oh, there is no roadmap for this. And I'm going to probably get it wrong a lot. And so I think it has helped me to, at least in working with clients, come out of some of these high expectations of myself to do treatment perfectly, or putting too much pressure on myself to do the work and figure out how to help this person. It's like we're walking alongside each other, and like I'm here to help guide you and be with you in your pain, but I definitely don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And so it's been a good practice in being wrong and apologizing and doing that repair piece that I mentioned earlier.
Circle back and repair. So I'm wondering if you can tell me something that your clients have taught you.
I think that something they have taught me is that healing is possible no matter what your circumstances are. I do think something I've learned along the way is that also requires the client to be willing to put in the work to heal. Like it's not like just coming to therapy, it just happens. There is work that goes into that. And I think I've heard some of the worst horrors a person could imagine, and just seeing people come out of that, and just still being such like beautiful people and being able to be in the world and heal and begin to have healthy relationships is really incredible to see.
Yeah, it's, we have the best seat in the house to get inspired by people facing the things they're the most scared of. And we're walking beside them. And so it's tough for us to not be inspired and motivated to tackle our own stuff too.
Yes, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah. Speaking of tackling stuff, I was wondering if you could share with me something that you do to take care of yourself.
I spend a lot of time in nature. I usually take maybe about like 2 weeks off a year where I go somewhere in nature. Last year, I went to Greece, and that was a very good recharge.
Wow.
This year, I actually recently got back from going to Colorado and Arches and Zion and the Grand Canyon and Sedona. So that is really helpful for me because it's almost like the beauty of the world is a good reminder for me that through the darkness that I'm sitting with, there's also always light and beauty in the world. So
and there's something
that's one thing
that is, no pun intended, like grounding.
Yeah.
To get out in it and to realize, oh, I am a part of this thing that I find beautiful and inspiring.
Yes, definitely. And then I think like through this pandemic, this is maybe bringing a little bit of nature inside, but I've gotten really into houseplants and taking care of them. And then not this past Sunday, the Sunday before, we decided to get a puppy that's going to be a therapy dog one day.
Oh my gosh. Do you guys have him already?
Yes.
Yeah. Please, breed and name.
He is, his name's Scout, and his dad was a golden doodle and his mom is a labradoodle. So,
oh wow,
he is like, I think like the breeder calls him like a double doodle.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago, one of my best friends also got a dog that he's going to use as therapy dog. The dog's dad was a golden doodle. The dog's mom was a sheep doodle.
Okay.
And he used the term double doodle as well. Yeah.
Okay.
And he named her Tonks. Big Harry Potter fan. So.
Oh, cute.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow, that's great. I wish that our dog could be a therapy dog, but he is too much of a spaz to do that.
Yeah. I was like sure to pay attention to the temperament because we actually have 2 other dogs, and one of them is highly anxious and kind of a spaz, and the other one can be a little aggressive with other dogs or around food. So it's like, both of you I don't think could pass the therapy dog test.
Mm-hmm. So let's say that somebody was listening to our conversation today and rightfully so think to themselves, oh my gosh, Natalie's amazing. I would love to become her client. How can they get a hold of you?
You can go to our website, which is safehaventherapy.com, or call our office at 615-241-6130. And then we actually also have a podcast that's called The Resilient Mind.
Nice. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. I'm going to be so excited to listen to some of it. Resilient Mind. Very cool. Natalie, thank you so much for coming and just chatting today and sharing just about the work that you do. And it's just been absolutely amazing, and I can't even thank you enough.
Sure. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me too.
Thanks so much for joining me this week in the theater. I'll make sure I save a seat for you and a friend next week. Let's raise the lights, lower the curtain, and say that for this week, the theater is closed.